Welcome to For Your Consideration. My name is Sterling Hedgpeth. I'm the programming manager for both the DocLands and the Mill Valley Film Festival. And you have just been watching Dara and Jasenovac, which is the official Serbian submission for the Best International Film for the Academy Award this coming year. And joining us is the director of the film, Gaga Antonijevic, and executive producer Michael Berenbaum. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
Happy to be here.
Gaga, Natasha Drakulic, who is actually also an actress playing one of the prisoners in the film, wrote the screenplay. How long had she been working on the screenplay, and when did you start working on the film yourself?
This is how it came about. Actually, the project was initiated by Michael and myself because the chain of concentration camps, it was a chain of the camps, not single camp, called Jasenovac during the Second World War, established and run by Croatian Nazi government at the time, Ustaši government, was the story which was known in circles of scholars and historians and obviously local in the Balkans, but was never ever made into the feature movie, though it's been now 76 years in April this year since the camp was liberated. And then Michael and I talked about that back in the day, a few years back now. And then we gradually started kind of thinking how to do it. Natasha Drakulic was excellent writer for the job because she does come from Croatia. She's a Serbian from Croatia, lost a number of members of her family, 6 exactly, in this camp, including her great grandmother. And Natasha played her role. She's a writer. She's not an actress, but she wanted to play her great-grandmother, and that's the scene when they are trying to separate the women from their kids and send them to work to Germany, and she's refusing to go because she wants to save the kid, and she gets killed. And she brought a lot of a real feel and a real experience to the whole story. She also was, in 1995, there was a big expulsion of the Serbs from Croatia in this recent civil war, and that's when she basically came to Serbia as a young kid, teenage kid, with just plastic bag and a few things to go with her. And that was a kind of a very good experience altogether. Michael was most instrumental for this whole story because Michael is a historian and somebody who knew this subject matter very well. He's been to Jasenovac many, many times before, during his work in the Shoah Foundation and other things. And I basically knew I could not make this movie without Michael's expertise, because I wanted to make the story which will be historically accurate also. And I did not want to kind of get into some local emotional disputes between this very, very close nation, Serbs and Croats, even you can say easily brothers because it's the same language. They might say now, no, it's not, or they're same, let's say, Slavic, group. But throughout the history, there's been a lot of kind of tensions between them. Some people have a theory of being too close sometimes makes people actually hate each other, like brothers can, Bible. That's how the Bible actually has the story depicted. But anyway, and then Michael helped me shape up this whole approach. And we were very, very happy that we were able to tell this story because simply it was during the course of last 75 years somehow overlooked. And Michael can probably explain more why that happened and how.
Let me add a couple of things. Jasenovac was an anomaly. It's the only death camp not established by the Germans, but modeled after the German enterprise. Germans established a series of killing centers, and the Ustaši government established a killing center, which was multiple camps. And what was unique about Jasenovac was not only was it a killing center, but it was a place where Serbs, Roma, and Sinti, whom we pejoratively call gypsies, and Jews were killed. And one other unique part of this, which Gaga builds off in the film, is it had a children's camp. And it also had a children's camp, and there was an attempt to re-educate, to what we would call brainwash Serbian children, to make them suitable for adoption by the Croatians, and that was part of the function of the camp, though obviously there was a tremendous amount of death in the camp. And what Gaga did and the writer did was to build on the nuances of the story. So scene after scene after scene is modeled after the actual experiences of real people who went through this. But the remarkable thing, which we have to give the director credit for, is that the story is told through the eyes of a child. So sometimes we don't see the horror, but we see how the horror registers in the eyes of Dara, who is robbed of her childhood, robbed of her innocence, and called upon to assume the awesome responsibility of protecting her brother and other children.
And it's an extraordinary performance. She proves how brave and resourceful she is in times of incredible pressure and incredible danger. Tell us a little bit about the casting process for Dara, because she plays such a major part throughout some of the most horrific scenes in the film.
If we missed in that choice, we would have, missed the entire movie, because the entire movie is on her shoulders, or rather what Michael said, in her eyes, And we did not want any kids who previously went to any film or acting schools, We wanted just kind of to find diamond in the rough. We went to the northern part of Bosnia, to Mountain Kozara, where a lot of basically families were taken from that place and put in the camp. And we look around the villages and some small towns and found around 1,500 kids initially. And we narrowed down to, few, but essentially along the way, she kind of stood up, and we knew all along that she would be the one. But still, on the first day of shooting, and that's basically first day in the scene, as they walk along the how do you call it in English? It escaped me.
The railroad siding.
Yes. If I was, of course, afraid, now we have like 300 plus extras. We have an entire crew. We have horses. We have many things. And what if she won't be able, or will get scared and won't do it the way she was doing when it kind of rehearsed and tried before? But she did it with ease, And then obviously we brought like psychologists to the set. We brought their teachers from their, elementary schools to be with us. We build them a special room for these kids that they can kind of relax between the, shooting, thinking, how they're gonna go through these scenes, because scenes were, looked real, people were shooting people. There's some horrible things happening and lots of emotions all the time. And but somehow these kids very quickly got into this whole process. We did shoot in the order. That did help a lot, for them to gradually kind of grow with their, let's say, roles. And then I believe strongly that they were special kids because they almost look like they come from the past. When there is a break, they will not go for the iPhones and play, games. They will just sit down on the ground and talk about some things. That doesn't almost exist anymore with the kids of their age. And we were very, very blessed by Dara especially, and the rest of the kids.
Let me point out a couple of very small things. Gaga did something incredible for films, which is he filmed them did the film in order, even when it meant moving from place to place. And you're moving a large crew, you're moving cameras, you're moving equipment and everything else. But one of the reasons he did that is because, unlike adults, kids grow over a 3-month period. And they don't look quite the same. And therefore, you have to take care of it. Gaga, why don't you tell them about the baby actor, Buda?
Buda was the, one of the triplets, because I did have a movie back in the day called Savior, and then there was a baby, in that movie, and then we realized, okay, let's have a twins because, one can sleep, the other can, be on the set. And then we went for the twins, but we found triplets. But when the three of them showed up on the set, they were all totally different characters, even looking alike a lot, but you see three human beings who are totally behaving in a different way. And this one was, we fell for this one in particular, and we did not end up using those other two, not even for the wider shots, and clearly it was a challenge, as Michael said, to do a movie within a certain period of time, because we didn't have a luxury of breaking a movie and continuing in 3 months, because by then Buddha will go to elementary school, kids grow very fast. We expanded their costumes like twice during the course of 3 months. And as we were joking, at the beginning, Dara, who's a very tiny girl, she was 10 years of age, but she's very small, was carrying Buddha. And then at the end of the movie, Buddha was carrying Dara, because he kind of grew up and had a good appetite, that's for sure.
In addition to Dara's story, there's another very powerful parallel story of Dara's father, who's involved in the burial camps, which was also ended up being a critical part of how the camps operated, and the camps were covered up in a lot of ways just to account for so much death. Tell us a little bit about that parallel story and the things that were involved in shooting that.
Actually, across the river Sava from Jasenovac proper, there is this called Gradina, this area where they basically bury the people. They would very often also bring them by ferry kind of across the river, and then, slaughter them either there or bring them already dead and bury them. And still they're like those mass graves where they were never basically excavated fully. They started it in the 50s, but then they stopped, and now it's some sort of memorial, park. And it's a very also important element of the whole story, because essentially these people working, they were very often recognizing their neighbors, their family, as they were coming in as dead bodies, but also they knew that they would expire very soon, because whoever was working there, he was, worked and used and then eventually killed, And for me, it was kind of very interesting to have a family divided, and then we kind of reunite them at the end. We don't, but we do. And, for me, it was interesting that the hope of that the other, father is maybe alive, will keep the girl going, and for father to hope that maybe, yes, he finds his son and the wife, dead. Very emotional and strong scene, but he knows that still there is a younger son and that there is his daughter that keeps him alive and, surviving. And that basically was important to bring that kind of a hope. And that's why this parallel story, I think, was important, very important for the structure of the movie.
Yeah.
There's also an ironic historical thing that we have to understand. The Germans referred to this as body disposal. And for those of you who are an echo of garbage disposal, they didn't have garbage disposers in that day, but the echo of how do you get rid of it. The most important thing to understand is the killing was the easy part. Getting rid of the bodies was the more difficult part. And that is, there was a backup throughout, and at the peak of some of the great death camps, the issue was not how many people we could kill in an hour or a day. The issue was how do we get rid of the bodies? And ultimately they decided on not burial, but burning, which had a double advantage, which is it not only got rid of the bodies, but eliminated the evidence of the crime. Because as Gaga said, you have material evidence of the crime in the physicality of those who are dead.
Right. Was there ever a truth and reconciliation type of Nuremberg trials that included the camp here, or was that a completely separate legal process?
Let me answer that for 1 second. there's a difference between it. I'm going to be technical for a second, but
Please.
forgive me. I'm a pain in the posterior historian on this. There's a difference between truth and reconciliation and the judicial process. Truth and reconciliation is based on the notion, especially in the South Africa version, where you confess to your crime and you implicate those who are higher up. And the ultimate goal is to reconcile. The Nuremberg process was based on rebuilding the scaffolding of justice, maybe even the illusion of justice. So there were trials in the aftermath of not only at Nuremberg, but there were an ongoing series of trials of these war criminals. Some of these people were actually tried. A couple escaped to Argentina. But that's an attempt of society to somehow rebuild by saying justice wins out in the end. And you rebuild the scaffolding of justice. I even call it in my work the illusion of justice, but the necessary illusion that there's some form of justice that can come, some form of accountability. And by the way, if that sounds a little bit contemporary, it's because when the unprecedented happens, you don't have an easy way of finding a solution to rebuild justice in its aftermath.
And because these camps were not run by the Germans, but were based in Croatia and Slovenia, what was the judicial process there? And was Nuremberg involved at all?
Nuremberg was not involved. But
basically, you know that at the end of the Second World War, the communists took over, former Yugoslavia. And then they did have a trials for some of these people who were involved with Jasenovac, and a number of them was tried, and some of them sentenced to death. For instance, that guy Mate Verban, who confessed for killing those 67 kids in a camp of Gradiška when he throws a Zyklon gas on them. That's true story. And but a lot of them escaped, because a lot of these Ustaše guys moved towards the Western Europe to Italy, and then with the help of some priests in the Catholic Church ended up in Argentina, South America, etc. At the recent time, in the mid-80s, they made some attempts, and basically some of them were brought back to Croatia to stand the trial for those crimes. That was still communist Yugoslavia then. But most of them were let, either they died before they were sentenced, or they were basically let die before the trials were completed, because they did not have enough of a interest in basically prosecuting them fully, because actually the other war, civil war of 90s, was already brewing in former Yugoslavia. And it's somehow unresolved issue. And I wish this movie was made way back, because I think it would have taken a lot of anger of the table, because a lot of Serbs felt when this new civil war, recent civil war in 90 started, we're not going to let them do that to us again, and then of course there is a action and reaction which goes in opposite direction, and they commit a lot of horrible things. But somehow had they fully discussed this issue, and basically, as what Michael said, reconciliation did not fully happen between those Balkan nations.
And remember, the trials are a top-down idea. You try the leader. You don't try every policeman in the camp, every soldier in the group. Truth and reconciliation, ironically, reverses the process. It's the bottom up. You confess, and then you implicate those above you. In one sense, the other is a symbolic act. Truth and reconciliation is an act of atonement. And this is what we would call today, and there's a technical term in it, it's called contested history. And that is that people can't agree on the past, in part because they're still arguing about the past and the present, and consequently the future.
going back to the movie, Gaga, you use a very artful conceit that ends up being very bleak and very powerful, and that's the scene with the train station with the empty cars that slowly some of the characters who have died start to occupy, and we see snow, which could also possibly be ash, and it ends up not providing the kind of closure you hope for. It ends up making the loss so much more powerful as a result. What was your intention around creating that as a part of an afterlife for those characters?
Basically, I was led by necessity to somehow give a poetic justice of some kind to those victims, you know, because they are dead. But I didn't want to do it through the blood only. I just wanted to kind of give some, you can't call it a hope, but, you know, they're going to some place, let's say, and, you know, we want to believe that, you know, in a way that we will not forget them, that the God will not forget them. And I felt this was important because it's about the death, but in a some more metaphorical and less gruesome way, because the rest of the movie is, you know, bloody and the tough, you know. And that was the, somehow also meant not to be a breather between all these bloody things, because breather is not, since it's again about the death, you know, but to continue the story about them dying, but in some kind of a more poetic way, if you can use that word for a death and the horrors they went through.
Let me suggest another part of this. There's part of what you were looking for is closure. The reality is there's a difference between tragedy and atrocity. In tragedy, there is some balance that brings closure. In atrocity, the most we can do is to salvage something from the ashes that in one sense doesn't make it a total loss without anything we can take forth from it. But there is nothing that can balance it in atrocity. And therefore, the wisest of all filmmakers does not give us full closure, leaves it open and makes us understand the real difference between tragedy and atrocity.
That's beautifully put. Thank you. The film is so immersive. It seems so, the fidelity to detail around the period and around all the horrible things. We know the scale of the loss was probably much worse than what we see, but what we see is so horrible. How did you want to balance? You talked a little bit about the metaphor, but also how did you balance the idea of what was too much to depict, simply because you didn't want to steer away from the atrocity that is occurring, but at the same time, we also need to, you know, find some kind of balance for the audience in terms of being able to process without being overwhelmed.
Let me answer that first with the following, and I observed it, so therefore I can do it. Gaga understood it. You see the film through the eyes of this young girl, through the eyes of Dara. And that forces the audience to imagine what she's seeing. They've caught a glimpse of it before, they've caught a glimpse of it during, and they catch a glimpse of its consequences afterwards. But because you're seeing it through her eyes, and she's registering in those magnificent eyes the catastrophe of what she's experiencing. The audience doesn't have to see it all, but it's not left free to escape it. It has to imagine it and fill it in. That's the key to understanding this film.
It was actually what you also, Sterling, what you said at the question, you know, you have to keep film watchable, you know, otherwise you miss the entire point. You can't lose the audience, but obviously you have to depict what happened. If you don't, you don't do the service to the, you know, subject matter. And this was something which we analyzed and debated a lot, you know, that fine line, how to go about that. And I think what Michael is saying was the idea, you know, why go through the young girl, why go through her POV instead of like direct, you know, dramatic events. And that's why I think we were able to kind of, I won't say lighten up, but to a certain extent at a certain moments, that train included, you know, to keep telling the story about the horrible events, about the death, murder, and atrocities, but kind of stay still on the level that people will be able to watch it.
It also doesn't allow the audience to become numb.
Exactly.
One of the things that happens in seeing terrible things, people get into shock and then they become numb. And only later does it register on them. Because we're, again, filtering it through the eyes of the young girl, they don't become numb. And since all of us were once kids, and many of us can still remember being kids, and psychologists would say we're still in some dimension kids, we understand her anguish at experiencing this and re-encounter it through her.
And it helps that Dara's sole mission, even though she's completely aware of so much that's going on around her, her sole mission is to save her brother. Her brother represents life, you know, not just life in a general sense, but the life that she is entrusted with. And we see a lot of her focus manifest there because that's what she's clinging to more than anything else: family, memory, and life. It's a very, very powerful scenario to build that.
Thank you. Yeah, the most important thing is her coming of age under the most horrible, you know, circumstances. And then, you know, there is that scene where, for instance, you know, she has to go and get the food, you know, but she doesn't have a bowl for the food. And then all of a sudden, you know, the Nazi guy kills the people around the, you know, the food yard, and then she just goes and picks up the bowl from the dead woman to whom she spoke just minutes before, and gets the food and goes to feed her brother and the other kids. And that's kind of a life, and that's adapting to camp life, and her ability to grow up in instant under those circumstances and to ultimately take care of her brother.
And again, that's a small detail, because the bowl was, in one sense, your most precious possession. Without it, you couldn't eat. Without it, you died. And without it, you had absolutely nothing. So people guarded their bowls with their life because it was their life. And that's true in so many memoirs and so many descriptions of what life was like in the camp and how you survived and endured.
Now we also see, and it's horrific in its own dimension. We see you talked about brainwash, essentially wiping out these kids' heritage completely in order to have them be part of this adoption circuit that occurs. Were there any efforts to try to find where these children who were adopted in other scenarios, where they originally came from?
Go ahead, Mike.
Let me add a couple of things. One of the problems with all of this is it was not only ethnic cleansing, but it was the notion of master racist. And therefore, the brainwashing and adoption of the kids, that was mirrored after what the Nazis did. The Nazis did that in, for example, an entire Polish town. They took any of the kids with high IQ, blonde-haired, blue-eyed, and brought them up in Germany. And ironically, for the parents, that's almost a greater loss than death. Because if your child dies eventually, you have to come to terms with it. If your child is stolen from you and adopted and brought up elsewhere, you imagine for the rest of your life that any child, any person who would be the age of your child in the general build and the general hair color, eye color of your child could be your child. And you're never reconciled to loss because there's no way in which you can put that loss to rest. There's no finality. And the attempt was, and Gaga will tell you the true story.
There was
behind
an attempt, after the Second World War, but unfortunately, this Ustashi government, all that documentation was lost, either burned or lost. And then there was not enough things available for people to find each other, but they did try, and there was like whole mechanism of people trying to figure out, are they coming from, that place? Did they have any relatives? And we know a number of people who were able to track down where they came from and some of their relatives, but unfortunately not to the extent, because a lot of those kids were adopted, converted, to Catholic religion, adopted in Croatian families. And some of them were told later and they were able to do something about it, but some of them were not, and real documentation kind of never fully existed or was not ever available, to be precise.
Let me give you two historical examples. In Poland, one of the women who arranged for the adoption of infants was a woman by the name of Verena Sendler, who lived to be 99, so we know her story in recent days. She kept the names of where she put each kid in a jelly jar, at the bottom of the jelly jar. And therefore, she was able to reunite children with their parents. In Poland, where a similar process took place, you had a very unique situation, which is many people grew up never knowing that they were adopted. And only in the 90s did they come out of the woodwork. And I had an experience in 1985. I was in Lublin, and they knocked at my door. I had spoken at the university, and I got a little bit of publicity. Knocked at my door. Man, 45, 46 years old, knocked at my door and asked me if I read Hebrew or Yiddish, and I read both. And he handed me a document. He said, "Would you read this to me?" I read it to him, and it was a letter from his biological parents to his adoptive parents and to him. And he had never realized he was adopted. And as I translated it almost mindlessly, I destroyed the man's entire life. Suddenly, his mother was not his mother, his father was not his father, his religion was not his religion, his past was not his past. And therefore, this becomes a process of rediscovery, which is also a shattering, because very few parents had the capacity to tell their kids that they were adopted and tell them the circumstances under which they were adopted. And we know today that if you have an adopted child, you tell the child early and often they're adopted and they're loved and they're a gift to you. And that solves 90% of the problem. But if you're afraid to say that because of the circumstances, then that remains a problem forever.
Gaga, Michael, has the film been seen in Serbia? And if so, under what circumstances, and what has the reception been?
Not yet, because we had only a qualifying run for the Academy. And we did not show the movie because of the corona. That's the only actually reason, because theaters were shut down, open up, shut down again, and you could not possibly launch any meaningful effort to put the movie in the theaters. That's why we are hoping that we will be able to do it in April, when there is the 76th anniversary of liberation of concentration camp Jasenovac. And also we are hoping that the movie will also be shown in Croatia, because I think it deserves that. And we'll see what the reactions will occur. I mean, honestly, I don't know at this point of time. There is a strong belief that this movie can do a lot of good in reconciling the, those two nations, but remains to be seen.
And remember that movies in a theater are a collective experience. And when I see that movie in Serbia, I'm not going to watch the movie, I'm going to watch the audience. I'm going to sit in the front of the theater and look back at the audience, because it's going to be interesting to me to see the audience interact with the film. And more importantly, that's what I want to do when I see it in Croatia.
Well, we feel really blessed, even though we couldn't show this in a theater, which we usually do. We usually show for your consideration at our theater every year. We're still very, very pleased that we're able to show it here online. Thank you so much for sharing the film. Thank you so much for sharing all your insight and your wisdom and your knowledge. And we really appreciate you joining us today. Thank you for everything.
Thank you, Sterling, for having us. Thank you.
You're welcome.